Okay guys, this chapter is about organizational culture, and so we're going to get started. Organizational culture. Culture is a pattern a pattern of basic assumptions that are considered valid and taught to new members as the way to perceive, to think, and to feel in an organization. Now, culture works in an organization, it works in a country just as well. Now, artifacts are symbols that in the culture that the physical work environment. Values are what those artifacts are built on. Okay, espouse values are what members of the organization say they value. That's different sometimes than what's enacted. So what might be on the wall might say, we're all about quality, but what's enacted might be, we really are just about getting the job done, and it doesn't matter if it's sloppy or whatever, as long as we got the job done. You can see the difference between espoused and enacted. Sometimes they're the same, sometimes they're not. Assumptions are different. Assumptions are deeply held beliefs that guide behavior and tell members of the organization how to think, how to feel, how to act. Assumptions are hidden very often. They're not very easily rooted out or changed. Now, this is that same thing with the artifacts at the top. And then values, and then the basic assumptions. Okay, so the basic assumptions are taken for granted, which leads to a greater awareness when we get to values, and then finally you get to that visible but not necessarily understandable level. Okay, now this picture is the new World Trade Center Freedom Tower in New York, and I put that there for a reason. This is an artifact, okay, and so it's an artifact, but it also talks about values. Why? Because there are certain basic assumptions that Americans hold. Now, I only gave this as an example because it's very easy for me culturally as an American. Okay, so the artifact is clear. It's a huge building. When I say huge, I mean it's huge. The Twin Towers that the terrorists knocked down in 2001 were 1,350 feet. This is 1,776 feet tall. Okay, there's a reason for that. There's a symbolic value espoused in that. What's 1776? It's the year that Americans signed the Declaration of Independence, right? So they were saying something implicitly, even in the architecture of the building. Okay. Now, values, when you have them, there are basic assumptions that underlie this. That no, we will not buckle down, or we will not knuckle under to terrorists. But the basic assumptions are always there in everybody, regardless of where you are. It's the same with the Hill of the Crosses in Lithuania. So basic assumptions deal with the nature of reality, time and space, nature of human nature. How do human nature? How do we relate to human nature? How will people behave? The nature of human activity. Let me talk about human nature for a second. So as a Christian, you have a working frame of assumptions. If you have a biblical worldview that humans are one, they are made in God's image. That's part one, right? They're not just randomness and chance. They're important. They have value in and of themselves. Part of that is that you have incredible creativity because God's creative, so do you. But then part of it is that what we know biblically is that humans have fallen into sin. So you got to watch out and be careful because they could also be very bad. So that would lead you to then have to limit power. If people have power, you restrain them from having too much power so they can't hurt other people. Right? All those assumptions are basic. They're in your head, but they're not necessarily stated. Okay? The assumptions that you have will then lead to the values that you espouse, and that will lead to the artifacts. Okay? So, functions of organizational culture. Culture provides a sense of identity, okay, of their members as they increase commitment to the organization. Okay? Culture is a sense-making device. It helps you understand what's going on and why things are going on as they are. It reinforces the values of the organization that pre-exist. And it also controls. If you can control with culture, you don't have to control by looking over someone's shoulder or checking up on them or whatever. If they're there for the right reason, they'll self-regulate, right? So think about people that you know at LCC. People that are there because they want what LCC is providing, this Christian liberal arts education, and they want to soak up as much as they can. They're probably not the disciplinarian problems that somebody say that's there only because they have to go or they don't have any other alternative or whatever else. Because the culture there, because they've subscribed to that culture, is a controlling device that's keeping them from engaging in problems. Okay, now there are theories about the relationship between organizational culture and performance. So the first is a strong culture perspective, and then we have a fit perspective, and then we have the adaptive perspective, and we'll talk about each of these. So a strong culture perspective is the first, the one of the larger ones. It says that an organizational cultural with a consensus on the values that help drive the company will cause certain things to be true. So for example, if you have a strong organizational culture, if everybody kind of agrees on certain aspects, well, then your goals are now in alignment. People are already kind of on the same page, and you can control without the oppressive effects of bureaucracy. You don't have to look over their shoulder. Now, this does not, and I'm saying not, does not mean that the culture, the strong culture, are the right values. Okay, because they may not be. I would say that, say, Al-Qaeda or ISIS cultures they're very strong, but they're not necessarily the right cultural values. Okay, so a strong culture just means that you're aligned. It doesn't mean that it's correct. Okay, now a fit perspective is a fit. It says that culture is good if it fits the industry or the firm strategy. Now this kind of makes sense because you have to have a fit in order to in order to sell your wares to the marketplace and that kind of thing. So what does the customer require? What's in the competitive environment? Those kind of questions. That's the question about fit. And then there's an adaptive perspective. And an adaptive perspective says culture that encourages confidence and risk-taking among employees, has leadership that produces change. So essentially an adaptive perspective is figuring out things are going to change. How do we change with it? How do we adjust? That kind of question. It's essentially dealing with leadership and developing leaders in the process. Now, there's a place for this, and there's a place where you want to be a little bit more careful. I would say in a nuclear power plant, I want you to be a little bit more careful, go by everything by the book. General business, however, I think an adaptive perspective can be very helpful. It's dealing with leadership. So here are the 5 most important elements in managing culture. What do leaders pay attention to? What do they think is important? That'll have an effect on a culture. How leaders react to crises. Are they cool and calm, or are they, oh no, the sky's falling, woe is me, we got to do something? How do they react to crises? Or even what do they expect crises to be, or what do they consider a crisis? How do leaders behave? That's another question. How do leaders allocate rewards and punishments? And then finally, how leaders hire and fire individuals. What criterion do they use? People will look at the leadership of the organization, and kind of determine what's important based on how they interact. Organization, socialization. Socialization is really a kind of a bad word to use here. It's not an appropriate word because there's too much political context. Take any political context out of socialization. All you're doing is trying to adapt people to a new culture. So it's a process by which newcomers are transformed from outsiders to participating, effective members of the organization. That's what socialization is. It's acculturation. Okay, now there's anticipatory socialization, that is learning that takes place before they get here. Then there's the encounter, when the newcomer comes and he learns what he has to do on the job and how to interact with others. And then there's change and acquisition, when a newcomer begins to actually do his job and do it well. So you have these different levels, the anticipatory socialization, the encounter, and then the change. And as you go through, you theoretically should be getting a lot better at what you're doing in the process, and then you should be performing very well over time. Socialization is as cultural communication. So if you look at how people are acculturated, if I can use that term, you look at role models. How did they interact? How did the people that are doing this right, who are applauded by the culture, how did they interact with things? What's the training that they receive? What's the behavior that they observe? Now, if you say, and we know this in our personal lives, if a parent says, hey kid, don't smoke, and then they're smoking, what's the problem? The kid's going to smoke because they see you doing it. If I had a choice between telling my children what to do or not to do and actually modeling it, modeling would win every time. Why? Because they believe what you do, not what you say if there's a conflict. Okay, accessing organizational culture. Organizational cultural inventory focuses on behaviors. Now, there's also the Kilman-Saxton Cultural Gap Survey, which looks at the expectations of people in the organization. Okay, and finally, there's triangulation. Triangulation is the use of multiple methods in order to measure organizational culture. Okay, so finding out and you know, this works generally, just triangulation. When you're trying to find out what's true about something, if you ask one person, you get a very biased view. If you ask 5 people, somewhere in the middle is probably what's going on. Okay. Let's go on. Situations that may require cultural changes are things like mergers and acquisitions. If I were a gambling man, and I'm not, but were I would bet against mergers and acquisitions most of the time. And there's a reason for this. What we know is that change is difficult, and that assumptions are often unconscious. We already talked about that. And people feel in a merger and acquisition like the psychological contract is being changed artificially. And so mergers and acquisitions that look good on paper don't necessarily pan out like you would like them to. So because culture is so deeply ingrained, it doesn't work often like you would like it to. I think it's like half the time it works out. Support for global view of business. If you're involved in global business, what you want to do culturally is complete a clear and simple mission statement so we can get on the same page. In the same way that you've seen this before, VeggieTales did not have a mission statement of any real meaning, and so Phil Vischer lost the company and those kind of things. Create systems that ensure effective information flow. Create matrix minds. Create global career paths so people can grow and experience different parts of the organization. Use cultural differences as major assets. This diversity can be really, really important. And then finally, implement some kind of worldwide management education or team development programs. Okay? And then finally, you need to make sure that you reinforce ethical behavior, okay? To the degree, remember what I said about the kids with smoking, clear communication of the boundaries of ethical conduct are important. Selection of employees who support the ethical culture, also important. Rewarding ethical behavior and punishing unethical behavior. Remember again what I talked about with smoking and the kids. If I say, oh yeah, but you're doing these bad things, and I reward that, or I punish them for doing the right thing, it's going to be confusing. Same thing in an organization. Finally, empowerment of employees to excel in service. Empowerment unleashes employees' creativity to the degree that you can allow everybody to be functional in the organization. You're going to have a much better time. Okay? It's not just about you and your brain. It's about you allowing everybody to use their brain. That's empowerment. Okay, well, we're about out of time. I will see you next week.